Ladies and gentlemen, Director Aube Giroux. Good evening. It's so lovely to be here with you all tonight, and I want to start by thanking Janice Morris and the whole KDocs Festival team for inviting me to take part. It's truly an honor to be here from the East Coast. I want to acknowledge that we're on unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, and that when we talk about the genetic engineering of living organisms, I think it's very important to keep in mind that there's so much to be learned from First Nations people about teachings, about the sacredness, the complexity, and the interconnectedness of all life on this earth. For the purpose of this talk, I'm going to refer to genetically modified organisms as they're more commonly known, which is the term GMOs you may be familiar with. And don't worry if you're not entirely clear exactly what GMOs are, because the film is going to go into a lot more detail. When GMOs started being used in our foods just over 20 years ago, many countries decided to label them on food products so that people could make an informed choice whether to eat them or not. And I wanted to make a film about GMOs, not because I'm against the technology of genetic engineering itself, but because I was frustrated that our government was refusing to label GMOs, even though it's the law in 64 countries around the world, and even though poll after poll shows that 80% of Canadians and Americans, more than 80% actually of Canadians and Americans want them labeled. Each time a GMO labeling bill has been tabled in our parliament, it's been voted down. The NDP, Bloc Québécois, and the Green Party have supported these bills, but the Conservative and Liberal majorities have, for the most part, voted against them. The debate on GMOs is often exclusively focused on whether they're safe to eat or not, but this ignores many other questions that I believe we should be asking. For instance, what kind of agriculture do GMOs encourage, and is it sustainable? What are the long-term environmental impacts of herbicide-resistant and insecticide-producing crops, which make up the vast majority of GMOs? What are the costs to farmers when their crops are unintentionally contaminated by GMOs? And should we even be allowing companies to patent living organisms? Even if GMOs were perfectly safe to eat, I believe we should still be deeply concerned by how they have accelerated an industrial system of food production whose main goal is not to produce nourishing foods, but to maximize profits for a handful of very powerful companies. But let's go back to the safety issue, because this is usually at the top of people's concerns. And safety is a thorny question because much of the research today is actually funded by the biotechnology industry. Those studies that have shown potential risks of GMOs have been aggressively attacked and discredited by industry. And needless to say, they have rarely received funding for further investigation. Instead, we're often told that GMOs are perfectly safe, and people who express concerns about them are often accused of being anti-technology and anti-science. So I'd like to read you what the World Health Organization has to say about GMOs and safety. Different genetically modified organisms include different genes inserted in different ways. This means that individual GM foods and their safety should be assessed on a case-by-case basis, and that it is not possible to make general statements about the safety of all genetically modified foods. So if we can't make sweeping safety claims about the safety of GMOs, because each one is different, then it's clear that we need a strong and reliable regulatory system, and one that can adequately assess individual GMOs. Now, if you look at our government's track record on GMOs, you quickly come to one conclusion, which is that the Canadian government loves GMOs and is very enthusiastic about getting them on the market as quickly as possible. We are the first and only country in the world that has approved a GMO animal for human consumption, and that is currently for sale for human consumption, and that is genetically modified Atlantic salmon. We were also the first country in the world to approve 2,4-D resistant corn and dicamba resistant soybeans. And you'll hear more about 2,4-D and dicamba in the film, but they're two very powerful herbicides that are used on GMO crops. Canada is also the world's 4th largest producer of GMOs, and 1/3 of our foods now contain glyphosate residues, which is also an herbicide that is used on about 80% of GMO crops. If you write to Health Canada with any concern about GMOs, they will write back and assure you that Canada has a robust, science-based regulatory system. But here's why we know that that simply isn't true. In 1999, our government wanted to reassure the public about GMOs, so they commissioned Canada's most respected scientific and academic institution, the Royal Society of Canada, to evaluate whether our regulatory system is up to snuff. The Royal Society released its report in 2001, and basically our government got slammed. The Toronto Star described the report as a polite but scathing indictment of the federal government. The report made 53 recommendations to fix our broken regulatory system, and here are just a few examples of those recommendations. They recommended that the industry studies, which the government uses to assess new GMOs, should be subject to independent scientific peer review. Right now, they are not. They recommended that the industry research data should not be hidden from the public and the scientific community. Right now, it is. They recommended that our government should develop the infrastructure necessary to assess the allergenicity of GMOs. They recommended that antibiotic resistance marker genes should not be used in GMOs, and that a national research program should be established to monitor the long-term environmental and health impacts of GMOs. So these are just a few examples of the very common sense and science-based recommendations that were made by the report. And out of those 53 recommendations, only 2 of the most minor ones have been implemented. Instead of actually making the changes asked of them, our government responded with increased public relations to promote GMOs to the Canadian public. The Trudeau government claimed that it would usher in an era of transparency and of listening to Canadians. And yet last May, when it had the opportunity to vote on a national GMO labeling bill, the Liberal Party ignored Canadians and sided with Conservatives to vote in favor of what industry wants instead of what over 80% of their constituents want. Just a few months later, the biotech company Aqua Bounty publicly boasted that it had just sold 5 tons of its genetically modified salmon to Canadians. But because the GMO labeling bill had failed, Aqua Bounty was under no obligation to label this new salmon, and so it didn't. In fact, when asked to inform Canadians as to where the salmon was being sold, the company completely refused to disclose any information. So we are the only country in the world that is allowing the sale of a GMO animal, and we have done so without ever asking Canadians if we even want to eat this salmon, and without giving Canadians the choice to opt out by providing a simple label. The biotechnology industry has fought tooth and nail to make sure that GMO labeling would never see the light of day in North America. In the US alone, the industry has spent more than $200 million in lobbying and advertising campaigns to stop GMO labeling laws from passing. So this all brings me to the number one question I get from people after watching the film, which is, what can we do? Well, one of the most powerful things you can do is vote with your fork. And over the next hour and a half, you're going to get to know my mom in this film. And she always repeated that with every single meal we eat, we have an opportunity to make the world a better place. The fact is that many GMOs are used to feed livestock, and so one simple, important thing you can do is reduce your consumption of animal products or opt for grass-fed and organic meat, dairy, and eggs. The other very important thing you can do is write to your MP and ask for 3 things. The first is ask our government to consult with Canadians before new GMOs are approved. Secondly, ask the Canadian government to fix our broken GMO regulatory system by implementing all 53 recommendations of the Royal Society of Canada. And third, ask that our government respect the wishes of Canadians, follow the example set by 64 countries around the world, and implement mandatory GMO labeling. Asking for these things does not make you pro or anti-GMO. What it does is make you pro-science, pro-transparency, and pro-democracy. So I hope you enjoy the film. If you'd like to know more, you can follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/modifiedthefilm. You can sign up for our newsletter on our website, which is modifiedthefilm.com. I'll also be around in the lobby after the screening, so feel free to ask me any questions. And just as a final note, if you want to know how your MP voted on the last bill, I have the list of all 24 MPs in the Metro Vancouver area and showing how they voted, so feel free to come up and ask me. Thank you so much for being here, and enjoy the film.